Okay, this lecture is the lecture that I did on Wednesday, 3/19. So you guys missed this lecture. We're going to start talking about Kennedy and Johnson. We'll talk about Kennedy first, and you're going to do kind of a sort of a big project with him, and I'll explain more about that later. So um, all the pictures will be in color now. We're moving on up in advancing in time. Maybe I can get this to work. There's going to be a little bit of kinks. There we go. So Kennedy and the Cold War. I don't usually talk to you about elections, but the 1960 election's kind of a big one. Um, JFK is elected as, go back. JFK is elected as, or nominated as Democratic nominee, Richard Nixon as a Republican. We've talked about Nixon before. He was kind of involved with that McCarthyism stuff. He served in Congress. Kennedy actually wins this election, and there are two factors that help him. One is the civil rights movement, right? So all of those events we talked about last week are on television, and so Kennedy has to kind of take a stance on it. He wants to be on what they say the right side of history. He doesn't want to look like a jerk like everyone else. So by supporting the civil rights movement, that helps him win the election of 1960. He gains the votes of African Americans. Television also helps him, right? JFK is very, very attractive. Richard Nixon's not so handsome. So they have the first live television debate in 1960 where voters actually see the two candidates, see what they look like when they're answering questions. Nixon shows up to the studio late. He's sweaty. He refuses to put makeup on. He gets on camera. JFK's agreed to makeup, just like a little powder, not anything serious. And he just is better looking than Nixon. So you got Nixon up there, sweaty, with a honking big nose, and he looks a mess. And although Nixon answered the questions better, people enjoyed looking at Kennedy more. So that was a big factor into helping Kennedy actually win the 1960 election. It was a close election. Kennedy gets 49.7% of the vote, and Nixon gets 49.6% of the vote. Right? Very, very close. Comes down to a tenth of a percentage point. But in order to win the presidency, you must win the Electoral College, and the magic number you want to get to is 270. Kennedy blew that out of the water. He got 303 electoral votes. Nixon only got 219. So Kennedy's clearly the winner. And we'll talk a little bit more about him being president in the next section. So as soon as Kennedy comes into power, he turns his focus to Cuba and Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro has overthrown the Cuban government, and he's instilled that form of government we all hate, communism. And so JFK's really got to pay attention to that. If you remember, our foreign policy is containment. We're trying to contain the spread of communism. So the way that Kennedy is going to approach containment, Truman had the Truman Doctrine, Eisenhower had the Eisenhower Doctrine. Kennedy is going to build up the armed forces because for 15 years, from 1945 to 1960, we haven't really had much of any military buildup. He wants to do this to be able to use flexible response, or kind of what Teddy did. And pull this down a little bit. There we go. Kind of what Teddy did. Teddy Roosevelt with the big stick diplomacy. Kennedy's going to ask the Soviets, please do this, and if they don't do it, he'll use the military if he has to, but before he can do that, he has to have a bigger military. So he also develops what we call the Peace Corps, an organization of young Americans, usually people who just graduated from college, that are going to go around the world on missions of freedom. Right? He uses this it's sort of like the Marshall Plan. Like, let's do really good things for people, and then when it comes down to them picking sides, they'll pick us over the Soviets. So the Peace Corps volunteers, and the Peace Corps still around today, they go to developing countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and they're helping these countries become developed. My best friend, Beth, who graduated from Bourbon County with me, just got back about a year ago from a 2-year tour in Africa. She was in Mali, Africa. And what her job was there is there are three different areas they focus on. One is technical assistance, where you're building communication lines and stuff like that. The areas that Beth worked on is educational services. She had an English club that she set up to help them learn English in the village she was in, and she kind of lived in a hut. It was a better hut than what you're thinking, but it was still a hut. She also worked with health services and women's health. So she worked in a clinic where they would deliver the babies. And she said women would come in, they would be in like full blown labor. They'd go in, no pain medicine, no anesthesia, deliver no epidural, deliver the baby, and be gone within 2 hours, which, as someone who just had a baby, I don't see how that's possible. But she would encourage them to go to the doctor to seek medical treatment, stuff like that. So we've had two other kids from Bourbon County go in the last 6 years. One went to Uganda, the other one went to Ghana. So it's a pretty big deal to get selected for the Peace Corps. If you're interested in it, want to know more, you can go to peacecorps.gov. Might be a good program for you to join. So in 1959, we've already briefly talked about this. Castro overthrows the Cuban government, places communist form of government in place. He helps the Soviets offer him aid. He takes it. Eisenhower, remember, because this is 1959, so Kennedy hasn't won yet, and the CIA, our spy agency, have planned this invasion to overthrow Castro. And some of you may have had the Bay of Pigs as one of your events in the last web quest we did. Here is the Bay of Pigs. Right here, it's just the bay. There are no actual pigs. That's just the name they have. Like we have Stoner Creek, they have the Bay of Pigs. And that's where we're going to drop off the Cuban nationals. What we do is we take people who are anti-Castro, so they're Cuban nationals, they like old Cuba, take them over to Mexico, train them, you give them weapons, their outdated guns from World War II, take them back to the Bay of Pigs, and drop them off on April 17th, 1961. It's a huge disaster. There's about 1,200 of them. We tell them we'll fly over with air support. We don't fly over with air support. And most of them are captured. Only about 300 end up getting away. The rest are put into military prisons, prisoners of war. And it makes the CIA look really, really bad. It also makes, and this says down here, Kennedy, also makes Kennedy look bad to Cuban Americans. It's going to be important to remember that Cuban Americans are upset with him over this failure of the Bay of Pigs when we get to his assassination. So the Soviets, meanwhile, love to parade around their nuclear missiles. So this is actually a parade in the Soviet Union. And they do that kind of as a scare tactic. But while they're doing this, the United States sends a spy plane, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. And we discover a medium range ballistic missile base inside of Cuba. So these are the missile ready tents. There's actual missiles in there. This is where the launch position would be. This is the missile erector, so where they would actually put it up. And this is in the middle of the jungle. Now, do you think that we're allowed to just fly over countries and see what they're doing? No, we're not, right? That could easily start a major conflict in the Cold War, a direct hot conflict between the two sides. But what we soon discover is these bases in Cuba, which is only 90 miles away from the United States, are pointed at all the major cities in our country. Right at this point, New York, D.C., Chicago, Detroit, L.A., Philadelphia are the biggest cities. They even have one pointed towards Atlanta. So this distance right here tells you the miles that they would have to go. If you look at these outside rings, it tells you how many minutes it would take for a missile to actually get to those locations. So less than 12 minutes for a nuclear missile to get to Atlanta, less than 15 for it to get to Chicago, D.C., and New York, and a little more than 17 minutes to get to Los Angeles. So absolutely no reaction time. Kennedy has to do something. Now, the American people aren't really up to date on what's happening during this time. It's not like now where we have a constant news feed of what's happening. But we have missiles also placed in Turkey pointed directly at Moscow and other major cities in the Soviet Union. So this isn't like a total surprise to us. Nikita Khrushchev is the Soviet leader now. He takes over after Stalin. The Soviets are bringing those weapons into Cuba. The U-2 plane, should be plane and not plan, discovers that the Soviets are building those bases and bringing more missiles in. So Kennedy has to make a decision of what to do. And we're on the brink of war here. It's like both of us have our fingers on the triggers. And if either one of us pulled that trigger, you wouldn't be watching this video right now, and I wouldn't be doing this lecture, right? We'd just be disintegrated and totally gone. So what he decides to do first is a naval blockade. So he puts the Navy, and that's what that dotted line is, submarine ships all around Cuba. And he says, well, at least we can stop them from bringing any more ships in, right? So meanwhile, here come the Soviets, and they're going to come head to head with our ships almost to the brink of war. This is called brinkmanship, when you try to push the other person to the edge, kind of like playing chicken, only you're essentially doing it with nuclear weapons. Not a good idea. It does not, however, address the issues of these complexes where the actual missiles are. So we have to come to some agreement with Nikita Khrushchev. This is one of our planes flying, and this is a Soviet ship, super, super close. I mean, if one of these Soviets came out there and was like a crazy sailor shooting off a pistol in the air, you know, that could have easily started a war, right? Just one single gunshot of somebody being an idiot would have resulted in the entire world being gone. This is a Soviet submarine. And if you look right here, this is one of our helicopters. We're kind of seeing what they're doing there too. So it's just really, really tense. We end up agreeing to take our missiles out of Cuba. As a result, we agreed to take our missiles out of Turkey if the Soviets take their missiles out of Cuba. So that's actually a good thing that we eventually worked it out. This went on for 13 days, and nobody in America knew anything about it. We avoid going to war with one another. Kennedy and Khrushchev establish a hotline or a phone line where they can directly talk to one another. And it's more or less like, hey, let's try to talk this out instead of pointing nuclear weapons at each other. All right, let's just talk on the phone first before we go that far. And lastly, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is signed, which is going to ban all above ground testing. So the things that Kennedy is most well known for in his short time in office was the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, support for the Civil Rights Movement. What he's more well known for, unfortunately, is his assassination. And that's what we'll talk about on the next video that I send down for you. At any time, you can pause, you can rewind, you can go back and look at these. You will need these notes to do the notes assessment questions that I'll be sending down for you probably sometime next week or after spring break. So let me know if you guys have any questions, if there's anything that you want me to change on this lecture and for the next lecture, and I'll be glad to do it.